The Crythian flagship was a colossal structure floating in the vast emptiness of space, its hull a dark metal surface that absorbed the light of distant stars, every inch of it a monument to their technological superiority. Inside the command deck, Admiral Norak stood before a massive holographic display, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the data streams that flickered in front of him. The reports were clear: the Crythian fleet was ready for the invasion of Earth. It would be swift and brutal. Humanity was no match for them. Their technology far surpassed anything Earth could muster, yet Norak could not shake the feeling that something was off. There was a sense of unease gnawing at him like a shadow that would not leave the back of his mind. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling persisted for weeks. The human species had been under their radar for years, but recent intelligence reports had started to highlight something strange about their behavior. The humans, while weak compared to the Crythians, had been showing signs of unexpected resilience in their military planning, and their adaptability was unlike anything the Admiral had anticipated. No matter what scenario the Crythians threw at them, the humans found a way to survive and even thrive. There was no pattern to it, just a relentless ingenuity that left Norak questioning the nature of his enemy. His war councils had brushed off the reports, attributing it to human desperation, but the discomfort grew stronger with each passing day. Then came the report about the child, a human boy, not even a teenager, who had been making waves in a Starship simulator game. This was no ordinary game, but a complex training program designed to simulate space battles and fleet tactics. Norak's initial reaction had been one of amusement. This was the source of the human resilience. They were relying on children playing games, but something about this particular child, Max, had caught the attention of the Crythian intelligence team. The boy's scores were higher than any other player by a large margin. He consistently outperformed simulations that were meant for military personnel. It didn't make sense why a child would be so good at this game, so good that the Crythian observers couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. The more they dug into it, the stranger it became. Max had a pattern in his victories, a series of tactics and strategies that went against the conventional methods taught to most players, yet somehow he was always able to turn the tide of battle in his favor. It was almost as if he knew the game better than the designers themselves. No one could explain how the boy managed to predict the enemy's moves so perfectly, how he could adapt so quickly to the ever-changing scenarios. The Crythians had started running simulations of their own fleets to see if any of Max's strategies might be something they would encounter on the battlefield. And to their horror, they found that the young boy's tactics weren't just effective, they were eerily similar to human countermeasures they had been planning for a possible alien invasion. Norak stared at the reports, his mind racing. The humans weren't just resilient, they were learning faster than the Crythians could comprehend. What if this wasn't just a game? What if the humans were already preparing for the war they had no idea was coming? He couldn't afford to underestimate them. He couldn't afford to make the same mistake that so many others had made when they had first encountered humanity. So he ordered the next phase of investigation. This child, Max, would be the key to understanding the real threat behind Earth's defense, and perhaps the key to understanding why this war was going to be anything but easy. Max sat in his bedroom, the soft glow of his computer screen lighting up his face, his hands moving quickly across the keyboard, his eyes fixed on the game in front of him. The sound of simulated starships and explosions filled the room as he carefully navigated his fleet through an asteroid field. He was playing the latest version of a popular Starship simulator, a game designed to allow players to take command of massive ships and lead them through strategic space battles. The goal was simple: win the battle by outsmarting the enemy fleet using tactics that had been tested in thousands of simulations. Max had been playing the game for years, since he was a little kid back then. It was just a way to pass the time, but now it was more than that. It was a challenge, a way to push himself further and further. Each time, the more he played, the more he learned, and the more he realized that he was good at it, really good. Max wasn't the best at sports or anything else that required coordination, but when it came to strategy games, he excelled. The older kids at school thought he was a little weird for spending so much time on a game that was usually reserved for older players, but they didn't understand Max had a gift. He could think several moves ahead and anticipate what the enemy might do and adapt in ways most people couldn't even if they tried. He wasn't just playing to win, he was playing to learn, to improve. Each game was a new lesson, and every mistake a new opportunity to get better. His latest challenge in the game was a scenario where he had to defend Earth against an overwhelming alien invasion. The enemy ships were fast, powerful, and numerous. There was no way he could win through brute force alone, but Max wasn't the type to give up or follow the usual tactics. Instead, he focused on exploiting the smallest weaknesses in the enemy formation, using diversionary tactics to draw the alien fleet into a trap. He had learned this from studying historical naval battles, reading about how clever commanders had won against greater odds, and it worked. The enemy fleet was scattered and vulnerable. He made his move, catching them off guard and securing victory by the skin of his teeth. As the final enemy ships were destroyed, Max felt the rush of triumph. It was exhilarating. But today was different. As he completed the simulation, the game gave him a new challenge, one that wasn't in the manual. The message on the screen read, "New scenario unlocked. Face the Crithian invasion." Max blinked, confused. He'd never heard of the Crithians before. He clicked the prompt and suddenly found himself staring at a vast star system on the screen. It wasn't just a normal game. The ships, the technology, everything looked realistic, far beyond what the game had shown him before. The enemy fleet consisted of large alien vessels that looked menacing and unstoppable. Max's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a game, it was something more. He knew it. Somehow the stakes felt higher. The feeling in the pit of his stomach told him this was different. Max played through the simulation with the same determination he always had, but this time he was more focused than ever. He set his fleet in motion with military precision, and within moments he found himself facing the same strategies that real-life military leaders would have used to defeat Earth's defenses. His hands flew across the controls in an instinctual dance of strategy. He anticipated every enemy move and countered with his own devastating tactics. He didn't just win, he crushed them. The Crithian fleet scattered in defeat. But something strange happened as the game ended. A final message appeared on the screen. "Congratulations, Commander. Welcome to the real war." Max froze, staring at the words, not understanding at all what they meant. Norak leaned over the holographic display, his fingers tapping restlessly against the metal surface. As he reviewed the latest intelligence report, the boy Max was becoming more than just an anomaly. His strategies were beginning to appear in real-world military simulations. The Crithian intelligence team had started running their own simulations based on the tactics Max used in the game, and to their surprise, they had proven shockingly effective. The patterns were eerily similar to strategies that would be used in a real war against a superior enemy. It was as if the child had been learning how to fight an invasion without ever knowing it was coming. The Admiral's mind raced through possibilities as he reread the data. The game Max was playing was far more than a simple simulator. It had been developed with deep military insight by a group of human engineers who had embedded complex combat scenarios into it, the kind of scenarios that predicted every move a fleet might make even under the most extreme circumstances. This wasn't just a game, it was a hidden training tool, one that Max had unknowingly mastered. The Crithians had underestimated humanity's ability to prepare for war, but this was something entirely different. Norak's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of his chief strategist, who had just entered the room with a new report. "Admiral, we've just analyzed the latest round of simulations that Max played, and the results are troubling." The strategist paused hesitantly. "The human child is consistently outmaneuvering every algorithm we throw at him. His strategies are unpredictable in ways that shouldn't be possible." Norak's eyes narrowed as he stared at the screen, the holographic representation of the simulations flickering before him. The child had won again and again, not just in ways that were statistically improbable, but in ways that exposed the weaknesses of the Crithian strategies. Their algorithms were designed to predict human behavior, but Max's moves were something else entirely. There was no pattern to his decisions, no logic that could be easily followed, no way to counter his brilliance, and yet somehow he was doing it over and over again. "Prepare a deeper analysis," Norak ordered, his voice steady, but filled with an edge of frustration. I want to understand how this child is playing the game. I want to know every detail about his thought process, every step he takes. The intelligence officers worked tirelessly to reverse engineer Max's gameplay patterns. They dug deeper into the server logs, analyzing his every move, his tactics and strategies. Every victory seemed to be a new puzzle piece falling into place. But the more they examined, the more they realized this wasn't just a product of the game's programming. It was Max himself who was the key to these victories. His ability to adapt so quickly to situations that didn't even follow conventional logic was becoming a point of fascination for the Crithians. Admiral, one of the officers, spoke up. "We found something strange. Max's most recent victories are using strategies that have never been seen in any previous game scenario. It's as if the game has started adapting to his thinking instead of the other way around." Norek turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the officer's face. "What are you saying?" The officer hesitated. "It seems as though Max isn't just playing the game anymore. He's influencing it. He's predicting moves before they even occur. His mind is operating on a level that surpasses the game's design. It's as though the game is reacting to him." Norek stood still for a moment as the realization hit him like a cold wave. Max wasn't just playing the game. He was somehow able to control it, to shape it around his thinking. It was as if the game was becoming an extension of his own mind. Norek felt a chill run down his spine. The Crithians had never encountered anything like this before. How could a human child possess such an ability to manipulate a game so thoroughly without even knowing the true stakes of what he was doing? "This is no longer about a game," Norek muttered to himself, his voice a low growl. "This is about the war." Max sat in front of his computer, fingers poised over the keys as the familiar glow of the Starship simulator loaded up for another round. He was still confused by the message that had appeared after his last victory. "Welcome to the real war, Commander." He'd thought it was just another gimmick, something to hype up the game. But something about it felt different. His heart pounded with excitement, but a strange unease crept in, tugging at the back of his mind. The alien fleet in the new scenario looked too real, too menacing. This time, the enemy wasn't just a faceless opponent. The ships bore markings he'd never seen before, shapes that reminded him of the reports he'd read about military ships, sleek, deadly, and designed for total destruction. But that was absurd. It was just a game, right? Max shook his head, trying to focus. He'd faced difficult scenarios before. He'd never backed down. He wasn't going to start now. The game threw him straight into battle. He found himself commanding a massive fleet, surrounded by enemy ships that immediately began closing in. It was unlike any challenge he'd ever faced. The alien fleet was organized, relentless, and well-coordinated. Max's heart raced as his fingers moved across the controls, his mind already working at full speed, considering all possible options. As the simulation progressed, Max relied on the strategies he had learned from previous challenges. But this time, the enemies were responding in ways he hadn't anticipated. Their movements weren't random. They seemed too precise, too calculated. Max's eyes widened as he noticed something familiar in the enemy formations. It was the exact strategy the Crithians had used in earlier simulations, the very ones his intelligence officers had designed. He had seen these tactics before. They weren't just part of the game. They were the tactics of an actual alien fleet. A chilling realization settled over him. This wasn't just another level in a video game. This was real. The same tactics, the same maneuvers, the same battle formations he'd seen play out on screen were now happening in real life. But how? How could the game have known? Just then, the game presented him with another prompt. Crithian forces breached the defense perimeter. Activate countermeasures. His fingers froze. The words weren't just part of the game. This was the scenario he had been playing in the simulator, but now it felt different. His instincts told him this wasn't just make-believe anymore. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him. He had no choice but to continue. He couldn't let the enemy win, even if it felt like the stakes had changed. Max set his fleet into motion, initiating complex counterattacks and flanking maneuvers that were almost instinctive by now. He forced the Crythian fleet into an unexpected retreat, exploiting their overconfidence and turning their superior firepower against them. The strategy was flawless, and within minutes, the enemy ships were scattered. It was another victory, but this time, the game didn't just congratulate him. Instead, it flashed a new message across the screen. Simulation complete. You have exceeded expectations. Your strategies are being noted for further analysis. Max stared at the message, the weight of the words sinking in. He had won again, but something about it felt wrong. His heart raced as the screen flickered, and suddenly, the familiar sound of a notification pinged. A message from the system appeared. Commander Max, your participation in this simulation has been noted. You are being watched. Prepare for the next phase. Max felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was something much bigger, something much more dangerous. He closed the laptop, his mind spinning, his heart still thumping in his chest. Was this really happening? He couldn't shake the feeling that the world he knew had just changed, and that the invasion wasn't something happening in a game. It was happening outside his door. The world outside Max's room felt oddly distant now, like everything had shifted into a separate reality. He hadn't told anyone about the strange experience he'd had with the game, how the simulation had felt too real, how he had seen the Crythian fleet tactics play out in front of him as though they were some kind of premonition. But the message was still fresh in his mind. Prepare for the next phase. Max couldn't ignore it. He had been playing for years, immersing himself in the game, trying to master every tactic and counter-strategy. But nothing had ever felt like this. His mind raced as he considered the possibility that his victories weren't just part of a game anymore. Was it possible that his moves, his strategies, were being monitored? And if they were, why? Who was watching? Meanwhile, far from Earth, Admiral Norak paced restlessly across the command deck of the Crythian flagship, his mind preoccupied with the same realization. The reports coming in from his intelligence officers were consistent. Earth's defense fleet was showing an unprecedented level of preparation. Their tactics mirrored the strategies Max had used in the simulator, tactics that had been designed by human engineers to simulate realistic combat against alien invaders. The Crythians had never expected humanity to be anything other than an easily crushed species. They had underestimated them, and now the tide was beginning to turn. Norak couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that the game Max had been playing was more than just a training program. It was a window into humanity's true strength, an intelligence-gathering tool for a war the Crythians had no idea was already underway. But there was something even more unsettling. The child, Max, had been playing it, and his strategic brilliance was far beyond what any of the Crythian analysts had anticipated. How had this child, this human boy, mastered these tactics with such precision? His ability to predict the fleet's every move had baffled the best strategists in Norak's command. On Earth, Max tried to push the fear out of his mind. He logged into the game again, hoping that it was just a fluke, that the previous challenge had been some kind of advanced level, a part of the game's design. But when the simulation started, it became even more apparent that something had changed. The enemy fleet was more sophisticated, more prepared. The game had escalated. He wasn't just facing a typical alien invasion anymore. The tactics used by the enemy were too calculated, too real. They knew his moves before he made them. Max felt the sweat bead on his forehead as he fought to control the fleet. It was a mirror of the very real threat that had once only existed in the far-off reaches of his imagination. He pulled his ships into defensive positions, using his knowledge of military history to outsmart the opponent. But the attacks didn't stop. The Crythian fleet pressed forward with more aggression than before, and every maneuver Max tried was countered with the same brutal force. This time, the game threw a curveball. A new fleet, even larger, more technologically advanced, emerged from the darkness of space, outflanking Max's forces. He had no more tricks, no more strategies to turn the tide. For the first time, he felt helpless. As Max tried to figure out his next move, a notification pinged across his screen. It wasn't a game prompt. It wasn't a challenge. It was an alert, a message that Max hadn't expected. This is not a drill. The real war has begun. Your tactics are being deployed. Prepare for the future. Max's stomach dropped. His mind raced. Was this real? The message had come from a source he didn't recognize, no longer just the game's server. It was coming from somewhere beyond that, somewhere far more dangerous. For a brief moment, Max wondered if he had somehow crossed a line. His mind flicked back to the message from earlier. Welcome to the real war, Commander. The chilling truth was beginning to sink in. He wasn't just playing anymore. He was being recruited, trained, prepared for something far larger than he could possibly understand. The Crithians had never expected humanity to be a real threat. But now, it seemed, they had underestimated the human spirit. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside his room. His mother was home. Max quickly closed the game, his heart pounding. Could he even tell her? Would anyone believe him? The lines between the world he knew and the world that was unfolding around him were beginning to blur. One thing was certain. Max was no longer just a kid playing a game. He was caught in the middle of something much bigger. And the war had already begun. Max couldn't focus. The message lingered in his mind. The real war has begun. His hands trembled as he sat in front of his computer, staring at the blank screen. It wasn't just the game anymore. Something else was happening. Something far bigger than anything he could have ever imagined. He had no idea who was behind those words or what was happening, but the weight of it all pressed down on him like a storm cloud waiting to break. For a moment, he considered telling someone, his mom, his teachers, anyone. But who would believe him? His friends would laugh at him. His parents would dismiss it as a crazy idea, a product of too many hours spent in front of a screen. And yet, deep down, Max knew something had shifted. He wasn't just playing anymore. Something was using his strategies, his tactics for a purpose, a real one. That night, while his mom was asleep, Max did what he always did when something troubled him. He returned to the game. But this time, when he logged in, everything felt wrong. The usual menu screen was gone, replaced with a dark void and a single line of text. Simulation, Earth defense. Max swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He clicked the prompt, and the world around him shifted. Instead of the usual digital landscapes and artificial intelligence adversaries, the scene before him was something far more menacing. It was Earth, his Earth, appearing before him in breathtaking detail, with starships hovering above, lasers flashing across the sky, and the unmistakable silhouette of a massive alien fleet coming into view. Max's heart raced. He wasn't just playing a game. He was seeing real battlefields, real events. The ships in the simulation weren't like the ones he had commanded in earlier rounds. These were real vessels, human ships, moving as though they had been perfectly coordinated. But where had he seen them before? Max's mind flashed back to the last few days, the way Earth's defense forces had been acting. Something had felt off. He'd seen the same fleet patterns in his simulations, but now they were on Earth's doorstep. And worse, Max knew these ships weren't just part of the game. They were in the sky, fighting a battle that seemed almost too familiar. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the comms. A commander's voice, deep and authoritative, echoed in his ears. "Commander Max, report to the fleet immediately. Your strategies have been implemented. The enemy is advancing." Max's breath caught in his throat. The message was clear. It wasn't just the game. It was a call to action. Somehow, his virtual strategies were being used in the real world. His heart pounded as he watched the enemy ships move into position. They were Crithian, the same ones he had been fighting in the simulator. But this wasn't just a simulation anymore. He wasn't just leading a fleet in a game. This was real. Before Max could react, a new message flashed on his screen. "You've been selected. Prepare to engage. Max felt his stomach drop. There was no going back. He clicked the confirmation, and instantly, his world changed. The screen in front of him no longer showed his bedroom, his comfortable chair, his computer. Instead, Max found himself standing on the bridge of a starship, surrounded by military personnel, their faces tense and serious. His hand instinctively grasped the controls. He was no longer a player in a game. He was in command of a real fleet, leading humanity's charge against the alien invaders. A communication from the Admiral cut through the static. "Commander Max, your previous victories have given us the edge we need. Now, it's time to win this war." Max felt a rush of fear, excitement, and uncertainty all at once. He had no idea how this had happened or what it all meant, but one thing was painfully clear. Everything he had learned, every decision he had made in that game, had brought him here. He wasn't just fighting to protect Earth. He was leading the charge. His strategies, his skills had transformed him from a kid playing in his bedroom to the key commander in a war that had no place for mistakes. He swallowed hard and looked around at the crew awaiting his orders. There was no time for second-guessing. This wasn't just a game anymore. The stakes were higher than anything he could have ever imagined. The war had come, and Max was at the center of it. Max's mind raced as he stood on the bridge of the starship, surrounded by a crew of experienced officers, all of whom were looking at him for direction. The weight of the responsibility hit him like a tidal wave. He was just a kid who had spent years playing a game, not preparing for real war. And now, here he was, commanding a fleet of ships in the midst of a battle he had never imagined would be real. "Commander Max," came a voice from beside him, breaking through the overwhelming noise in his head. He turned to face the officer, a tall woman with short black hair, her uniform crisp and clean, stood at attention. "We've received the enemy's latest position. They're moving in. We need to make our move now." Max looked at the star map in front of him. The alien fleet was huge, far larger than anything he had faced in the simulator. Dozens of ships hovered ominously in the distance, their dark silhouettes cutting through the stars like a swarm of locusts. This was no game. His heart thudded in his chest as he realized just how real this situation was. Every choice he made could lead to victory or catastrophe. His fingers hovered over the controls, every move feeling like it carried the weight of the entire planet. His mind flashed back to his previous battles in the game, the tactics, the moves that had worked, and those that hadn't. The familiar patterns of the Crithian fleet floated into his mind. He'd seen these before. He knew what they were capable of. But this wasn't the simulator. The enemy wasn't predictable in the same way. The Crithians had been playing their own game for thousands of years. They weren't going to go easy on him. "Max, we need a decision now," the officer said, her voice steady but urgent. Max inhaled sharply and made his choice. The strategies that had won him every victory in the simulator came to him now like muscle memory, except this time, there was no restart button. No second chances. "Deploy the defensive units," he ordered, his voice firm. "I'll take the center. Prepare for a flanking maneuver on the right." The officers immediately moved to their stations, executing his orders with military precision. Max watched as his fleet split into two, one portion moving forward to engage the enemy head-on, while the other veered to the right, aiming to take the Crithians by surprise. "Enemy fire incoming," the comm officer shouted, her voice shaking slightly, shields holding at 60%. Max's heart skipped a beat. The Crithians had anticipated his move. Of course they would. They were experts at this, but Max wasn't about to back down now. He studied the holographic star map, watching the movements of the alien fleet. There was a gap in their formation, a vulnerable spot he could exploit. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best chance he had. "Move the flanking unit in tighter," he said, pointing at the map. "We hit them at their weakest point. Don't give them time to regroup." The crew immediately began to respond. The ships under his command moved swiftly, pushing toward the gap in the enemy's defenses. The sound of the battle filled his ears. Blaster fire, the hum of engines, the shrill alarms from the damaged ships. His heart pounded in time with the chaos unfolding before him. "Commander, the Crithian fleet is shifting position," the radar officer reported. "They're bringing in reinforcements." Max felt his stomach drop. More ships. He'd anticipated this move in the simulator, but it had always been a simulation. Here, the stakes were different. If he failed, if his strategy wasn't enough, Earth could fall. The weight of that thought nearly brought him to his knees. But there was no time for doubt. There was only time for action. "Switch to evasive maneuvers," Max ordered. "We can't afford to be caught in a crossfire." The ship rocked as enemy fire hit the shields, but Max refused to let up. He couldn't hesitate. The fate of millions rested on his decisions. The flanking unit pressed forward, breaking through the enemy's outer defenses. His ships were closing in, and the Crithians were starting to falter. "Focus fire on their command ship," Max commanded, his voice louder now. He had to be sure. A moment of silence passed, then the order was carried out. The enemy's flagship took a direct hit, the explosion rippling through the fleet. The Crithians were on the defensive now, their once organized formation beginning to fall apart. "Victory is in sight," an officer said, a note of relief creeping into her voice, but Max didn't feel it. Not yet. Not until the last ship was down. He kept his eyes fixed on the battlefield, his hands steady on the controls. This was real. It wasn't a game. But for the first time, Max felt like he belonged here, leading humanity's charge in a war they had no idea was coming. Max's hands moved faster than ever as the battle unfolded in real time. The alien fleet was retreating, but the victory felt hollow. The Crithians had taken heavy losses, but they had no intention of backing down. Max could feel their relentless aggression, even in the virtual world, but it was no longer virtual. It was too real. His eyes flicked across the holographic readouts, tracking the movement of the last few enemy ships as they tried to escape the encroaching human forces. "Commander, we got one more push coming in from the Crithians," the radar officer called out, his voice tense. "They're bringing reinforcements from the far side of the sector." It's a trap. Max's mind raced. He had anticipated this. In the game, the Crithians had always had an ace up their sleeve, a hidden reserve force. But in real life, if he failed here, everything would fall apart. He could see the faces of the crew. Their lives were now in his hands. The crew had trusted him with their lives based on the strategies he perfected in a video game. It wasn't just strategy anymore, it was survival. "Hold steady," Max ordered, trying to steady his own nerves. "We've faced worse odds. Now we're going to finish this." He took a deep breath and surveyed the star map. He had no time for hesitation. This was the moment. Every move he'd made up to this point had led him here, to this critical moment. A slight misstep, a wrong decision, and Earth could fall to the Crithians. He wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not after everything. Max shifted his fleet into a new formation, leading the charge with an aggressive strategy. He set the center unit to engage the alien reinforcements head-on, using their overconfidence against them, while he positioned the flanking units to sweep in from the sides. It was a high-risk maneuver, but it had worked before. His hands flew over the controls as the fleet shifted into position. "Commander," the tactical officer spoke, "we've got incoming fire. Shields at 50%. Max didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He had to keep his focus. Every movement, every calculation was life or death. The ships around him rocked with the intensity of the Crithian fire, but Max pushed forward. "Push through," he shouted. "We can win this if we stay in control. Don't let up." His ships advanced, their cannons firing in perfect synchrony. The Crithians tried to regroup, but Max's strategy was working. The flanking units cut off their retreat, forcing the alien fleet into a deadly crossfire. Max watched as the enemy vessels began to crumble. One by one, they fell. The explosions lit up the starry void, their wreckage floating in space like the remnants of a lost battle. "Enemy flagship is down," the radar officer called out. "We've broken their lines." Max could hardly believe it. His heart pounded in his chest. The battle was turning in their favor. The once unstoppable Crithian fleet was disintegrating before his eyes, retreating or destroyed. The reality of what was happening hit him all at once. The strategies he had learned and refined in the game were now saving the lives of billions. He wasn't just some kid playing a simulation anymore. He was leading the charge, saving Earth from annihilation. But there was no time to celebrate. The last few alien ships were still fighting back with everything they had, desperately trying to hold on to the fight. Max focused. The final stretch was approaching. The pressure was unbearable. But he couldn't let up. Not now. Not when they were so close to victory. He activated the final phase of his plan. An all-out assault that would completely envelop the remaining Crithian ships. His fleet surged forward in unison, overwhelming the last of the enemy forces with an intensity that left no room for retreat. Max's heart skipped as the final enemy ship exploded into a brilliant flash of light. The battle was over. The Crithian invasion had been repelled. "Victory!" someone shouted from across the bridge, but Max couldn't find the words. He stood there, staring at the display, the weight of everything that had happened sinking in. He had done it. He had led humanity's defense against an alien force unlike anything the world had ever seen. But the question that still lingered in his mind was one he couldn't shake. Why had they chosen him? Why had the game, the simulation, led him here? Before he could dwell on it, a new message appeared on the screen. This time, it wasn't from the game. It was a direct transmission, encrypted and from an unknown source. "Commander Max." The voice on the other end was calm, composed, but Max could hear the underlying urgency. "You've done well, but this is only the beginning. Prepare for the next phase." Max felt his stomach drop. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot.